Good morning everybody and welcome to this week's Motor Trade Radio podcast in association with eBay Motors Group. It is Saturday the 29th of August and you are joined by myself, Philip Nothard.
And me, Curtis Hutchinson, episode 375 and counting. And this week, Phil, we've got a new tagline, which is chatter that matters.
Yeah, we're having that one, aren't we? We do like that
we
one.
are, yeah. We must thank from the outset David Billsborough for that, because he posted that on Twitter in response to last weekend's episode. So chatter that matters. Yeah, we like that, David, and we'll hang on to that.
Yeah. So expect to see that on all the social outputs from now on. We'll take that one and keep that one. I mean, can you believe 29th of August, Curtis? You know, we're just around the corner from the 1st of September. You know, it's what a year it's been so far, hasn't it?
Yeah, definitely. Everything is now on fast forward and seems to have been for a number of months now. So yeah, it's the new plate change coming in on Tuesday, and we've actually got an interesting story which we'll get to in a minute on September thoughts for both new and used. So lots happening at the moment. There
is, and we've had a great interview this week as well. Our 20th in the series of special sort of midweek interviews, and you know, it was kind of started off around the COVID during lockdown, and then we've sort of talked around sort of the recovery following the lockdown, and how the sector is starting to recover and some of the learnings from COVID-19. But we managed to get Neil Addley on, didn't we, from Judge Service, who's the founder of Judge Service, and talk through some of the stats that he'd seen during lockdown and some of the observations from their business following the restriction lift, isn't it?
Yeah, and there's some interesting trends. So we'll be running that interview after the headlines. So do stay tuned for that. But yeah, he's got some interesting things to say about local trends, local customers, and distance buying as well, and who's going for what. So I found that really interesting.
So as you say, we've got some interesting headlines this week. Not massive, big headlines, but certainly some interesting headlines to run through this week.
Yeah, so headlines this week are from The Times, The Independent, Car Dealer and Motor Finance. And yes, we'll look at the September plate change because lots going on there. We've also got quite a lot this week on used cars. We'll ask the question, will used car values ever return to normal? We'll look at used values in August. And also, are we seeing an emergence of two distinct types of used car buyers? We've got an update on job losses at Mini's Oxford plant, and we've got an and finally this week, which is which we'll see. Let's put it this way: we'll see an unexpected addition to the UK's EV charging infrastructure.
Yeah. Not what you may think, Curtis? But yeah.
No. But here's another clue. Fancy a pint, Phil?
Yes, definitely. So we'll get off with the first one, and you kind of mentioned it just before around the this week's, and it was quite a good story and quite a rounded story from the Times on the new car market, and some interviews there with both Robert Forrester, Dash Gupta, and Sue Robinson from the NFDA, and they're talking about the new 70 plate is make or break month for the car trade, and you know it's really looking at in isolation what September means for the 2020 new car market, but actually what does that mean for the remainder of the year now, and obviously some of the views from both Robert and Sue and Dash on what they're expecting.
Yeah, it is a revealing piece, this, and as you say, it is balanced, and also it's not behind the Times paywall, so anyone can access this story, which is good news. It starts off with this concept. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but revenge buying, which is one of those sort of buzzwords that's kicking around at the moment, and it's about this sort of aggressive buying intent amongst buyers who have been cooped up, been unable to buy, and that they've got money that they wouldn't normally have, possibly because they haven't been on holiday, and they're thinking, right, I'm going to buy a car, which obviously for car dealers is brilliant news as we head into September, because as we know, September, it's the second biggest month of the year for new car sales, but it's also a big month for used car sales. So there's quite an optimistic undertone to this story. You've got Robert Forrester and Dash Gupta both talking about strong order banks, and Sue Robinson also talking about, September is vitally important, but Q4 is also very, very important for the trade. And the sentiments out there going into September is fairly upbeat, considering what we've all been through.
No, you're right. I think it's very difficult these days, and I think we've talked about it pre-COVID-19 around that impact on September, particularly around the previous years with WLTP and followed then by RDE for the car market, and what that did for September as a month. But actually, when you start looking at it from an August, September and October perspective, and as you say there with Sue, you kind of need to look at it for the year and the quarters rather than isolation of month on month, because it doesn't, these days, it doesn't give you a true picture. I mean, we know that last year it was 343,000 registrations. Year before, because of WLTP, it was 338,000. But historically, September is a 400,000 plus month. So, how this September will perform, and as you say, I mean, anecdotally from conversations I'm having across the network, order banks are pretty good. I was talking to a dealer yesterday, and actually they're saying that if the order gets in quick enough, they can still get the car in time with the customer's specific orders on colour and spec, and still get it into the month of September. Whereas a dealer I was talking to the week before was saying that really now they're looking at October for any new car orders that come in, unless it's a physical car sat there ready to go. So again, very much manufacturer dependent on stock, very much dependent on availability, but you've got to look at it over the longer term. And this third quarter, the finish of the third quarter and the fourth quarter are going to be absolutely crucial for this year, and many manufacturers will be pushing hard to sort of maximise the return this year. We know that there's WTO, we know the conversations that are taking place around tariffs, which will actually lead us on to a potential interview that we've got lined up for next week. But a lot of the manufacturers are going to try and do what they can to recover the drop in lockdown and to get ahead of what the potential risks are around WTO for the end of the year.
Yeah, and just to give a flavour from the big dealer groups, so Robert Forrester, he's quoted as saying, order intake is up strongly, consumer demand is up substantially. And we've got Dash Gupta of Marshall Motors saying it could possibly be one of the biggest Septembers on record, but with one caveat: supply. And of course, supply is the big unknown at the moment.
It is. That's the key. There's a lot of car. Anything we or you put anything out in the social space around new car orders and supply, you get the answer that there's. What about all these cars that are sat in fields? And we know that we talked about it in the days when Brexit was the weekly headline on the podcast, wasn't it? That there's a lot of cars coming over, a lot of cars going into storage ahead of the Brexit situation. But it's down to the right car and the right spec, the right colour for the consumer and the buyer. That's key. There is a lot of cars sat in fields, but it's not necessarily what everybody wants. So it's that's really what the dealers and the manufacturers will be working hard on at the minute, to get new product and supply into the UK, as well as work their way through some of the product that is actually sat in storage that's been there throughout the year.
Yeah, now the next two stories are both looking at used car values. The first one is from AM Online, and the headline is Used Car Values Unseasonably Strong in August, reports CAP HPI. So this is really an update on what we've been talking about for the last 2 or 3 months about the strength of used car values. So the latest analysis from Darren Martin at CAP HPI is that prices rose by an average of 0.2% across the sector over the course of August. So this is following on from trends in July and June. And, it is showing the strength of used car values at the moment. And the next story, which we'll get onto at the moment, sort of poses the question, when will used car values ever go back to normal?
Yeah, and it's difficult, isn't it? Because at the end of the day, we know that there's some supply constraints at the minute with what we've just been talking around in the new car market and the impact of lockdown, and that was kind of, supply was a challenge pre-lockdown, to be fair. So, but as you say, CAP HPI year to date for the 9 months going into September is 0.2% up for the 3-year 60. Now, historically, last year we were down 14.6, year before down 3.6, year before that 7.5 at the same time of the year. And really the average, seasonal average from 2005 onwards is average about 8.6% down for that year to date point. So we are unseasonally strong, but the market is strong. The demand is there, supply is still constrained in certain areas, and people are still out with activity. It's kind of what reflects what you were just talking about from Robert, Dash and Sue on the previous story, that there is demand out there. Consumers are buying cars, and the retail market is strong as well. So the question is when will supply start to come through, and what will happen with values when it does? At what point will values start to realign themselves? And as you say there, the next story sort of leads on to that a little bit in terms of what came out from Car Dealer Mag, and some of the comments there from people, from ourselves with myself and with Mark Robinson from eBay Motors.
Yes, yeah, and indeed, Darren has a thing or two to say in this story. So, yeah, just picking out on some of these comments. So, Car Dealer poses the question, when will prices ever get back to normal? So, Mark Robinson from eBay Motors Group, he makes the point that forecasting used car prices is a minefield at the moment, as no one really knows what's happening with the pandemic or the economy. So, there's two huge variables there. But he goes on to say, one thing we have learned from the COVID-19 lockdown and restart is just how quickly things change, not just in the used car market, but across all retailing sectors. So he goes on to say that, as we go into recession, which we are now, with many employment and societal variables in play, forecasting future price trends with any degree of accuracy is perilous. But he does point out that cars advertised across the eBay Motor Group platforms in July dipped by only 0.6%, while inbound inquiries from used car customers rocketed by 153%. So again, evidence of the demand that's out there at the moment.
Yeah, and Darren makes a kind of sums it up really well. And he's put that I'm not sure that there is a normal. What is normal now? Historically, if you look at the used car values, pre the financial crash of 2007, what happened there? We saw the recovery. We've then seen what happened last year with the realignment of values, and then this year we've obviously got the impact of COVID on both supply and demand in the market. So it's a very, very difficult one to forecast, and it's you wonder what will happen. Is it that supply will start to come through, start to ease those values. And I suppose really, I mean, I think it was Darren that commented that when we interviewed him on the podcast during the lockdown, that, you know, what really goes up must come down, really.
Yeah.
You know,
Yes.
those used car values will need to realign themselves. That 3-year-old car will need to align itself to the 2-year-old car, the 1-year-old car, and the cost new of those vehicles. And, you know, we know that is coming. The question is when will it come? That's, you know, there's a lot of focus on Q4 of this year and what that will look like, and whether we will see a realignment of values in the fourth quarter.
Yeah, and interestingly, just staying with Darren briefly, he does talk about future values, sort of 3 years hence, and he's saying that they are currently tracking at the level they were before the crisis. But he admits that between now and then, there's some tough times.
There's a lot that could happen. I mean, who predicted COVID? You know, that's the thing, isn't it? There is so many variables and so many external influences that we can't predict. So it's you know, I think it's going to be, you know, Q4, Q1. You know, what will happen? You know, we look at that curve. Some of the conversations I've been having with contacts within the network, we know that there's a curve of realignment, a curve of depreciation, and potentially the view is that the longer we stay at that level market or up, the decline could be steeper when it does come. You know, that drop could come, that the curve remains the same in terms of the end point, that 2-3 years time, but actually the severity of the drop increases the longer we stay strong. But at the end of the day, we are in a strong market. The dealers, the retailers, the vendors, everybody needs to capitalise where they can at the minute, because we don't know what's coming around the corner. So you know, it's good. It's good that we are in this, because to be fair, you and I, nobody predicted the strength of the market, did we? Coming out of lockdown, no. You know, that's the key, and that's really what some of the guys do comment about, and Mark mentions it, doesn't he, around that? You know, who could predict the strength of what the consumers were going to do? And as you say, that revenge buy-in is really pent up demand in that marketplace.
Yeah, and that it does link with our next story, which is from Motor Finance, and the headline is Start Line. 2-speed used market to persist for rest of 2020. So this story is all about buyer profiling, and it's based on comments made by Paul Burgess, who's the CEO of Startline Motor Finance, who was one of our guests actually last year. Yeah, we had a good chat with him. Now he's talking about two groups of buyers who have emerged, and he sees this emergence continuing throughout 2020. And they're basically two groups of spenders: the like to spends and the have to spends. So the like to spends are very much the sort of revenge spenders that we were talking about earlier. So, you know, they're back in the market, and they came back with a vengeance in June. They're financially secure, and they tend to be buying higher value cars using larger deposits over shorter terms, according to Startline's research on this. And he seems to think that these buyers will stay in the market for the foreseeable future. Yeah. Now, the opposite of that is the have to spends, those who find themselves in a position where maybe they haven't got a car at the moment, they need to buy one because they don't want to go back to using public transport, they're not ready to do that. But, you know, they're doing this against a backdrop of declining consumer confidence, worries about job security, economic uncertainty. So there's some interesting dynamics playing out here at the moment in the used car market.
Yeah, I mean that's always been. I mean, it's been the case, hasn't it? You know, that necessity and desire to purchase are two different variables, and I think these. Interestingly, I mean, we were talking before this, and the interview with Neil Addley at the end that we're going to put on, and some of the sort of variables around the distance that people are travelling, and everything else around the type of vehicles versus, the mainstream versus the premium vehicles, and some of the activities that they've noticed through their systems. And you can see that potentially COVID-19 has sort of increased the sort of balance between those. I mean, it's interesting how we're starting to see the variance of consumer behaviours as an impact of COVID-19. What do you think? I think it's kind of as it accelerated and really sort of highlighted some of these, as you say, the variables between the need to buy and the want to buys, both in terms of the finance side of things and the distance to travel. I mean, Neil talks about people travelling 200-300 miles for their cars, and you sort of, we're in localised lockdowns and things like that, and people are still travelling for good distances, but for the right type of car.
Yeah, no, you're right, and I guess the point that Paul Burgess is making in this particular story is the ongoing importance of dealers packaging the most appropriate finance deals for different types of buyers.
Yeah. It's I mean, the minute there is increased, necessities, and I think again, it's hate to say it, but Neil does. We talked to Neil about that, don't we? It's there is dealers and retailers have got to really understand the consumer behaviours that are now prevalent in the market and align their business to those behaviours, both finance, type of vehicles, etc. So it's going to be interesting times. And I suppose we posed the question to Neil, didn't we? That do you think this is a short to medium term change, or is this to stay? Is the big question, and maybe that's the same kind of question with Startline. Is this a consequence of COVID-19 and therefore short to medium term, or actually is it going to change consumer behaviours for the future?
Yes, so you are listening to the Motor Trade Radio podcast in association with eBay Motors Group, the only weekly podcast serving the car retailing sector, and available by subscribing on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Deezer, and SoundCloud.
So the next story, we're returning to Car Dealer Mag, and you'll be pleased to know, Curtis, there is a top and bottom to 10 to run through, or top 5 or bottom 5, whichever way you want to do it today. But
we've potentially got a top 50.
We have, yeah. Well, let's be conscious. We've got an interview at the end of this the headlines, but yeah, I mean it's a great story. Sort of again aligning with some of the early stories from the Telegraph with Robert and Dash there, but Arnold Clark tops list of the used car dealers with the most used car stock. And it then says, but where does your dealership rank? And this goes into the story around the size of Arnold Clark and some data analysis from Car Condor, who have analysed the used car market.
Yeah, they're not a company I'm familiar with, but what they've done is they've looked at the online classifieds, and they've looked at stock listed by some of the bigger dealer groups and car supermarkets, and they've come up, as you say, with this top 50. So let's look at the top 5 and the bottom 5. So number 5 in this listing is Inchcape with 7,205 vehicles in stock. Number 5, Car Shop, which of course is part of Sytner's, and they've got 8,328 cars listed. Number 3 is Sytner with 8,406 cars. Number 2, Evans Halshaw with 11,174 cars in stock. And as you say, number 1 is Arnold Clark with a whopping 24,714 cars in stock. So that's twice as many as second place Evans Halshaw. So they're the top 5 players. If we just look at the bottom 5, so we've got Williams with 1,113. Lloyd's Motor Group with 1,094, LSH Auto with 1,084, Eden Motor Group with 1,058, and at number 50 is Harwood's Group with 1,050 cars.
Yeah, and I mean, there's probably one question I've got with this analysis is that the third place is Sytner, which is obviously part of the Sytner group, and fourth place is CarShot, which is part of the Sytner group as well, with 8,400 and 8,300. So that actually would put them as second place of just sort of 17,000 units in stock. But I'm just saying that that's the way I would probably look at it in terms of entire used car marketplace. But anyway,
I would agree with you as well. And Car Dealer also points out that the data shows the impact of the acquisition of Imperial Cars supermarkets by Cazoo, because that more than doubled the previously online-only used car dealer stock of 1,758 cars when Imperial's 2,000-plus used car inventory is added on top. So they're listed, but they're down the rankings.
I think what is clear with this, and joking aside, I think you look at some of those operators, you look at the volume of vehicles in stock, you talk about our previous stories around used car values and the strength of the used car market, etc., and you can see where the operators have done this for some time. We've talked about it numerous times on the podcast, both ourselves on some of the headlines and some of the interviews, and the importance of that used car market for these businesses. You start looking at the volume of these used cars that they've got in stock, the number of outlets, and therefore the dependency on used car revenue for their business is key. And it's more key than ever now with some of the challenges for new cars. So some great analysis there, and we'll probably look at it in more detail at the future at some point. So going over to BBC News now, and this is a story that's brought this week, and this is about BMW Mini Oxford car plant set for hundreds of job losses. And it's kind of one of them things that we know these are either on the way or already happened in many ways, but it kind of highlights some of the impacts of COVID-19 and the dependency of import-export on the UK car market around production.
Yeah, you're right. So it's 400 job losses out of 950 agency personnel, which would normally be on site. So they're the jobs that are affected, and it's as the result of BMW Mini revamping, relooking and rescheduling its shifts, so that there are shifts being lost because of the downturn in demand. And this isn't obviously just in the UK, this is across Europe and internationally, the Mini's international markets.
Yeah, and as I say, I mean, they do talk about it, that it is a worrying time. The Human Resources Director, Bob Shankly, said that, like other automotive manufacturers, that their volume forecasts for 2020 have had to change accordingly, and therefore made the difficult decision to adjust their shift patterns at the Mini plant from October. So you can kind of see some of the impact of this, can't you? I mean, it's there's challenges on efficiency, challenges on productivity, and there is still a necessity of social distancing in the physical environment, and it's going to have an impact into it as the furlough scheme starts to ever come closer to ending at the end of October, unfortunately. So it's a difficult time for many, I think, at the minute.
It is so, and finally,
Yeah.
we go over to the Independent, and the headline here will give away the story, but never
Just a
mind.
bit.
But it's so it's the headline is that this really did catch my eye, and I had to reread it a couple of times because I thought, no, I've got the wrong end of the stick on this one. Headline is Green King to install charging points for electric vehicles at 900 pubs across the UK. Yeah, this is rather unexpected, isn't it? So over recent weeks and months, we've talked about the EV infrastructure and who's doing what, and the likes of McDonald's, Costa Coffee, and the various Starbucks, other providers putting in charging points. But this is a national network of pubs. What do you think of this one, Phil?
I mean, it's kind of. I mean, we were talking before the show. It wasn't the most obvious connection for EV investment of the network infrastructure, of the correlation between a pub serving alcohol, and although many aren't, a bit of a difficult question at the minute with lockdown, etc., etc. But you can kind of. I mean, we sort of, we were laughing about it, and you think about all the other sort of conveniences and public things that could take place in terms of installing EV charging points, and pubs wouldn't have come straight to the forefront of your thoughts around that one. But maybe they are just ahead of the game. Maybe we are thinking of level 5 autonomy of the vehicle. Maybe they're getting there first with EV charging points, so that when the consumers can rock up in their autonomous vehicle and not have any control over the driving of that car, that they can go and have a few pints, and the car will take them home at the end of the night fully charged at the pub. Possibly, but maybe not. But I think with this though, these days, on a serious note, the pub isn't just for alcohol, is it? It's not just for drinking. It is a social place. There is a good way of, as you really highlighted out, right? With our conversation, that this gets EV charging points into the rural areas, which possibly would have been a challenge otherwise with this.
Yeah, no, I think that is an interesting point, because Green King, it actually operates 2,700 pubs across the UK, so that is a big network.
It is, yeah.
Yeah, and they're talking about 900 premises by the end of this year, and it's that rural infill, I guess, where they could actually make a difference. And although I like your future vision of being driven home by an autonomous car after a night out.
We're not quite there yet, but yeah.
We're not, no. But of course, if you are driving along, you can stop at a pub for a coffee, a Coke, something to eat, whilst you plug your car in and recharge it. So maybe this has got legs.
And thinking around, it's an opportunity to add to the survival of pubs. Let's not kid ourselves. I mean, we're digressing slightly, but we know that a lot of pubs are closing down in the UK. But this is another reason for consumers to go to a pub, if that's just for a bite to eat, or, as you say, a coffee and a chat. That it is another reason for the consumer to go to your local pub and use their charging facility, because as we know, you cannot get EV charging points very easily into the rural areas, and this is maybe a good way of doing that, and keeping some of these pubs going for the future. So no, great opportunity, and I think that it'd be interesting to see if other businesses such as Green King follow on this and start to add it, because to be fair, if they do, it'll be a very quick way of, as you say, that infill of the UK charging infrastructure for EVs, and it takes it away from that motorway network and into the B roads that people can still get their vehicle charged, which is always a question, isn't it? I mean, if you look at planning a route in an EV, it's predominantly via the main motorways and
Yes.
dual carriage rates, because that is where a large proportion of the EV charging points are. And when one of those is shut, as we know, it becomes a bit of an issue for EV drivers when you need to come off that main structure. So, great, joking aside, it is a great opportunity for that.
Yeah, who would have thought?
Who would have thought?
Yeah.
But, I think that's it for this week, isn't it? I think there's some interesting stories, some different stories in there, and we haven't really talked about acquisitions and things like that, which I'm sure are coming. But great interview at the end there with Neil as well.
Yeah, so that is it for this week. You've been listening to the Motor Trade Radio podcast, brought to you in association with eBay Motors Group. Do stay tuned for our interview with Neil Addley, founder of Judge Service. And as we've mentioned, Neil talks about the role of reviews and ratings, and he does have some interesting survey results on local and distance sales, and also some top tips for the September plate change. So join Phil and I again next weekend for more chatter that matters. See what I did there, Phil?
Yes, you did. Yeah, we've got it in.
Yeah. We'll have our regular review of the headlines, and do also look out for an interview we'll be running this week, which will shed some light on something we talked about last week, which is the agency model. And does it exist? Does it have a future in the UK in the franchise sector? So we'll be having a special guest on the show to talk about that. So until next week, until next week, good luck with the 1st of September, because obviously a huge week for dealers across the country. So good luck with the September plate sales, which start on Tuesday. Yeah. But until next week, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him. Hello and welcome from me, Philip Nuthard and Curtis Hutchinson, to this special Motor Trade Radio podcast brought to you in association with eBay Motors Group. So many thanks again for joining us in this 20th in our series of special interviews themed around sharing best practices as car retailers continue to manage their way through the COVID-19 crisis. As you know, previous interviews with Suzuki boss Dale Wyatt, Mitsubishi MD Rob Lindley, Marshall Motors Dash Gupta, and Adrian Daly of the Finance and Leasing Association, and many more are still available to stream online from Apple and Google Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud and Deezer.
Now today we're delighted to welcome our special guest, Neil Addley, founder of Judge Service, the online dealer customer service, insight and reviews service. Welcome to the show, Neil.
Hi, thanks. It's great to be here.
Yeah, no, great to have you on the podcast, Neil. By way of a brief backgrounder for listeners, you launched Judge Service in 2011 following a career in the motor trade, which included head of marketing roles at major dealer groups, namely Perry's, CD Bramall and Reg Vardy, as well as key suppliers including RBS and motors.co.uk.
So, Neil, I mean, again, welcome to the show, and it's a pleasure to have you on at long last. So, I mean, probably the best off starting around what happened through lockdown, and as we know, the dealerships were closed across the UK from the end of March until the phase reopening from the 1st of June, and with doors closed during this period, and dealer websites took on the heightened importance. I mean, what role did you think ratings and reviews play during this period from your perspective?
Sure. Well, there's plenty of evidence that reviews really help keep engagement of people on websites and also encourage customers to be confident in dealing with a business. And I guess this is particularly true when dealerships were unable to welcome walk-ins. And so customers had no other way really of verifying whether this was a great place to do business with. So I think reviews, ratings are undoubtedly a key when it comes to choosing where you're going to buy a vehicle from. But probably more important for us was during lockdown, we did a lot of surveys pro bono, if you like, for our clients, and to understand what their customers were feeling about lockdown and what would happen when we came out of it. So this really helped inform our clients and to an extent the rest of the trade of the customer concerns, but also of the pent-up demand that we could see for servicing and used cars.
Now, following on from that, Neil, you've been closely tracking website usage, both pre and post lockdown, and you've recently published some research about a boom that you've seen in local searches. Can you take us through some of those findings?
Yeah, for sure. So what we have seen, and it's quite pronounced actually, is a huge surge in people buying locally. And by that, I mean within 5 miles of where they live. That's increased from about 32% of people pre-pandemic, so in January, February this year, to 53% of people post-lockdown, so since the industry reopened on June the 1st. And this is particularly pronounced when it comes to volume cars, if you like, or volume brands, with that being 57% of people buying locally. What's also interesting is that people buying from a long distance, which we define as over 50 miles, has also increased since lockdown was lifted, as people shift to buying online. So that's risen from 10 to 15% of people on normal brands, and on premium brands, that's even more, to 19% of people for premium brands. So I suppose it's the middle distance, the medium distance purchases that have been squeezed, with some people wanting to buy locally, almost creating their own sort of purchase bubble, if you like, and other people prepared to buy anywhere online because they expect to get the car delivered.
But that's quite interesting. So the increase in local searches was mainly based around volume brands. Is that what you found?
It's much more pronounced on volume brands. So the more expensive the vehicle, the more likely you are to have travelled or have had it delivered via the internet.
And do you think that's a significant shift? I mean, was that something that was there in the first place? Was there a disparity between the mainstream versus the premium brands in terms of distance travelled, or was it a fairly level market?
There's always been a intention to travel further if you're prepared to buy a more premium brand. I guess it's the finding exactly the right model and spending a bit more on it means that you're prepared to travel a bit further. But this has been exaggerated, I think, by the situation. I think that more and more people are looking online to buy cars, and I think that's something that's pretty likely to stay.
And in terms of, I mean, fantastic, interesting findings there. But does that, what do you believe? Does that show the power of the local marketing? And from a dealer's perspective, should they be looking at focusing and placing long distance sales to attract customers from outside of their local area? And could this then also will this prompt a growth in demand for online sales? I mean, what's your view as to what should the dealers now be thinking, either in the immediate short term post lockdown and recovery from COVID, and potentially the longer term change of behaviours from consumers?
Sure, that's a really good question. So I think the local angle is interesting, and we've seen an increase in people saying that they've bought a car after engaging on social media or from where they've had their last car serviced. So certainly in the short term, I think a focus on local activity, whether that's social stuff or even giving vouchers to people in your service department, makes absolutely perfect sense. But in the long run, the biggest increase that we've seen has been people saying they found the actual vehicle they were going to buy online. And that's gone up from 21% of people pre-lockdown to 27% of people post-lockdown. And I think that change is probably here to stay. I think that the local purchase thing is probably a short-term thing, or not short, but medium-term thing, that will gradually relax as we get used to the new norm, or maybe there's a vaccine or better treatments for COVID.
And do you believe it's kind of, do you think there's been an influence from, because obviously there was the, post-lockdown, England versus the sort of, Wales, there was this travel restriction in place. And do you think some of that was influenced by sort of localised travel restrictions, or do you think it's broader than that?
I think it was just a bit of a mess by government policy across the four nations, to be honest.
Yeah.
I think joined up thinking has been something that's been quite lacking during this. Although in the end, I guess to get out of this, there will need to be regional decisions made, whether that's local lockdowns or whatever. But what we've also seen is a marked change in consumer attitude to buying online, where before lockdown, again, around 5% of people said that they'd normally think about buying a car online, whereas that's risen to 16% of people now, which makes it really important that dealers are working with their vendors to make sure they've got online purchase ready stuff, whether it's finance, part exchange, or just being brilliant at the basics. The internet's become an even more powerful tool, and that's been accelerated, I believe, by COVID, but will be here to stay.
And Neil, looking at specifically at reviews and ratings, what would you say are the most common customer gripes about dealers, and how should dealers be addressing them?
So the first thing I'd say is you need to measure your own gripes. Whether you do that yourself or you use someone like us to do it, it's up to you. But you need to have a handle on what's going on in your business and what your team are saying to your customers. So the most common gripes are really around communication and rushed retailing. So what do I mean by that? So communication, firstly, customers, when they're trying to buy a car, you wouldn't believe the number that say that people don't get back to them.
Yeah.
So that's a big gripe. Second one would be when they're trying to arrange delivery of their vehicle, the disinterest sometimes from some people in getting back to the customer to sort that out. And finally, there's the post-contact call. I was always taught that 3 days, 3 months, and 3 months thereafter, keep in contact with your customers. And so we measure that as part of what we do. And again, that's something that only around half the time is done effectively. So communication is the first thing. And particularly if it's supposed to be a lost sale, it's mad that we're not following people up. Then the other gripes come around what we call rushed retailing. That can be that finance hasn't been explained properly in some cases. And the others would be where we're trying to rush delivery. So either the car's not mechanically prepared properly or the car's being poorly valeted. I know when I was selling cars a long time ago, occasionally you'd try and get a car through valet bay and you'd have to cut corners because you'd promised delivery too soon. But it's just a case of taking a little bit more time and making sure we do the job right, because customers would rather have the car in mint condition than perhaps having it a day early.
And following on from that, Neil, in terms of the pandemic and dealerships reopening from the beginning of June, are you finding that customers are possibly a bit more forgiving now in their reviews? In terms of how they're dealing with retailers?
Yeah, so we specifically ask about social distancing and stuff like that in the surveys, and customers' feedback has been extremely positive. I guess, unlike other retailers, we have the advantage of having big facilities, so we're able to social distance. Talking to some of our clients, the challenge is more around making sure the customers do social distance rather than us providing the facility ourselves.
So in terms of the customer reviews, and you say obviously integral part of the online retailing, and you mentioned earlier about obviously that acceleration in that online experience of purchasing their vehicles, and you kind of mentioned it there within the dealers around that it's more about the customers adhering to the social distancing rather than probably the dealers enforcing it to a certain extent. But what is the type of typical feedback that you get about the dealers and having their reviews and ratings on their website? Because as you said before, that increase in activity online, we've talked about obviously the acceleration of that adoption of that e-commerce proposition as COVID has highlighted those that didn't have a sort of a cohesive proposition for consumers. But what do you believe? Are the dealers in the hall embracing the reviews and the transparency of reviews on their website, and really to add to that, and have you how have they evolved, and is there still some resilience from having reviews on their website?
So we push review content not just to their website and ours, but also to Autotrader and motors.co.uk. And I guess when we first started, and sometimes when we bring a new client on, they are a little wary that they're going to get bad reviews. But the truth is, most people, if they're spending 15 grand on a car, they're buying it from someone they like. And so most of the reviews you get are positive. And by asking for feedback, what you get is the positive view of the majority, rather than if you leave it to their own devices, you only really get reviews from the highly motivated, disgruntled few. So actually, when you look at the reviews that we get, 95% of people are really happy with the experience. So we urge dealers to use the reviews to promote across their business and the other channels, but to use the insight more than that to make sure that they improve the customer experience and continually do so, because it might be perfect right now, but things change in terms of the sales team themselves, maybe the leadership, and so you do need to keep on top of what the customer experience is in every single dealership. Yeah. And so that's why we have real simple rules, which is that you should send us all your data of all your customers, no cherry picking. You survey everyone, and you should either publish everything or publish nothing, because otherwise you lack integrity in the way you're using your review content.
Yeah, I think you're right. In terms of that, it's you don't want to see 100% 5-star reviews, do you? Because I suppose there's a consumer perspective that that's unrealistic. I mean, you're into some of the Amazon world, aren't you, with that kind of thing? But
sure.
Thinking about the COVID recovery, have you noticed anything, or has there been any feedback in terms of consumers' expectations? Have they dropped their expectations because of things like COVID? Is there a bit of a relaxation of what they expect from a dealer, or do you think it's remained as it was pre-COVID? Or because potentially you've got new people entering the online space, haven't you, in terms of that purchasing a vehicle online, and you've got, in many ways, you've got retailers that didn't necessarily have an online proposition, and they adopted it during COVID and were kind of new to that marketplace.
Sure. I think, and this is a little bit anecdotal rather than statistical, immediately after people started coming back into dealerships for their vehicles to be serviced or to purchase, there was definitely a feeling of real goodwill to all men. I think that as we've got more used to the post-COVID situation, then we've returned to a much more normal state in terms of the feedback that we see from customers. That's not that it's got worse or better, it's just about the same as it was before. I think other than the wish to shop more locally in many cases, I think that things in terms of car buying have to a large extent returned to normal, where retailers, resilient bunch, and we've adapted, and maybe we're doing test drives without a salesman with the customer. We're doing click and collect, or we're doing home delivery. But customers' expectations, I think, have more or less returned to what they were pre-lockdown.
And following on from that, Neil, and last question for you. With the 70 plate change upon us from next week, what is the best advice you can give dealers today regarding getting their websites ready for an influx in interest in new, nearly new, and used in what could be a bigger than normal September?
Yes, so I think you're right. It could well be bigger than normal. Certainly, many retailers that we're talking to are expecting to see a really strong end to the year, not just perhaps September, but into October and November as well. So I would obviously counsel all retailers to make sure that they've got a customer insight program and reviews on their website. But I think the key things for me are that the website's never been more important. And that's really being brilliant at the basics, whether it's a new vehicle or a used or a late plate vehicle. That's photos, pricing, spec. Customers aren't forgiving if you don't have those right, because they just won't inquire. I think as well, particularly given the paucity of stock at the moment, that we should really be focusing on part exchanges. It's a great way of sourcing stock, and it's a deal winner. We've actually created a survey that dealers can use to measure their part exchange valuations, which is available for anyone to use right now. And then the third, I'd say, is don't waste leads. So whether it's using someone like us or doing it in-house, third-party follow-up is a surefire way to sell more cars. And then I guess my final thought would be, remember, car buying should be fun. It's an important part of people's lives, and they should be enjoying the experience, whether we're post-COVID or whether we were pre-COVID.
So, I mean, fantastic insight there. And I think you're right. I think you can get too hung up, I suppose, on reviews, can't you, Neil? I think I think it is what it is. I think if you're doing the business right, you're looking after your customers, you're meeting their expectations, you are transparent. We are moving in we've been in that direction change towards digital and that online end-to-end proposition for some time. COVID has accelerated it, obviously, in terms of the recent months, but I think what you're saying there is there has been some dynamic changes around that distance travelled, type of vehicles people are prepared to travel for. I think there's are you going to go and travel 200-300 miles for that vehicle that is on 95% of forecourts in some form or another, or actually you prefer to travel for that something that's a little bit more unique, a little bit more different in spec and meets your requirements. But I think from what you're saying here, I think that transparency is good, and I think it is about being transparent, feeding everything into operations and businesses such as yourself, so that you can demonstrate the results. But I think you sort of opened it right at the start, I think, if I'm correct, that that area of not getting back to people and not responding to emails and inquiries come in. I think that is probably a key point that many retailers have either adopted or haven't adopted, dependent on their business.
Sure. Yeah, I think this is just a massive opportunity to sell more cars and vans.
Yeah. No, it's good. It's good. I mean, to be fair, thank you for coming on. I think we've known each other, and you've known Curtis for a while, and obviously what you're doing for the dealerships throughout lockdown and pre-lockdown, and obviously with now the survey around the part exchanges and things like that. I think that's a key element that the more that moves on into the online space, we need to understand how the consumers are reacting to it, don't we, as a business and a sector. So thanks for coming on, and it's really appreciated that you eventually come onto the podcast.
No, thank you very much for having me, and have a great day.
Many thanks, Neil. Great to catch up with you again, and many thanks for a good timely update on how dealers need to keep on top of reviews and ratings and their websites in general, especially as we head into the plate change. That's all we have time for now. You've been listening to this special Motor Trade Radio podcast brought to you in association with eBay Motors Group. Please like and share on social media, as it's important during these times for the dealer community to work together and share experiences and best practices. Many thanks to you for listening and supporting the podcast. Philip and I will be back with the industry headlines on Saturday. Until then, stay safe and stay well.